All right, Alexander, let's talk about the US economy and let's talk about the Chinese economy. And there are some celebrations coming out of the Biden White House that they're presenting the narrative that they've got everything under control, that gas prices are going down, they've managed to get a grip on inflation, and it's smooth sailing ahead. At least that's kind of the narrative that they're presenting. Meanwhile, in China, things don't appear to be going so well. What's the real story behind these two superpower economies?
Right. Well, I think the answer to this is that illusory optimism in the US combined with growing concerns in China. Now, let's talk about the US first. Now, I of course, have lived through the earlier period of elevated post-war inflation, which was in the 1970s. And I can tell you this, brief ups and downs in monthly figures don't mean very much. You have to look at the overall trend. And it seems to me that the overall trend is still firmly up. What happened was that fuel oil prices fell. That meant that gasoline prices also fell. That took some of the heat off some of the prices in the US. But the overall trend, I think, is still very much for prices to go on rising. I think that we're going to start to see, come the autumn, oil prices start to rise again. I think there are people in the US government who know that perfectly well. I still think that the highest inflation in the United States, the absolute peak point in inflation, has nowhere close to being reached. And I'm going to tell you something else. I think the Federal Reserve Board thinks the same. I mean, we had all these officials from the Fed, they were pouring cold water on all of this. They're still talking about raising interest rates. Now, I know the arguments that, that the interest rates are not about inflation, that they're about screwing the Europeans and the euro, and I buy that up to a point. But I think it'd be very much harder for the US, for the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates if inflation really were coming down. So I think the Fed, which is much better informed about these things than the White House, doesn't believe that inflation is coming down. I think they believe inflation is going to go up and continue to go up. And I'm sure that they will go on putting up interest rates. So I think that we'll see more inflation in the autumn and more interest rate hikes and a deeper recession. So that's where the US is going. And in China, it seems to me, and bear in mind that all of these things are connected. We've seen that these inflation-related interest rate hikes around the world and the policies of the Federal Reserve Board in hiking up interest rates are causing money to tighten pretty much everywhere. It's now clearly feeding in to the Chinese housing and construction bubble to a degree that I think few people had understood the very high growth rates that we saw in China in the last decade were related to a housing bubble situation. And the Chinese central bank is having to do the opposite of what the Federal Reserve Board is doing in the United States. They're having to cut interest rates, and they're having to cut interest rates because they're worried about the property market collapsing in China. And of course, China has very, very low inflation indeed. It's 1 to 2%, and that in a time when everybody else's inflation rates are rising must mean that demand in China is very low. And that must be affecting the overall performance of the Chinese economy. So it seems to me that both economies, both the US and the Chinese economy, are in trouble, and I suspect both are in recession.
The Chinese economy in recession.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, if you look at the figures that the Chinese churn out, they suggest continued growth. But I think that the reality is, if you strip away the figures, remember, figures are only statistics. If you look at the real economic activity in China, I think the Chinese economy is in recession. Now, that isn't the end of China. That doesn't mean that China is about to fall apart or collapse or implode or any of those things. Recessions are a normal part of an economic cycle. China is overdue a recession. It needs a recession to rebalance its economy. The manufacturing sector still looks healthy and strong. The problem is growth has been artificially sustained for several years now, many years now, through this housing and construction bubble. That has to be unwound, and that requires a recession, and I think China is in recession.
Which country do you think is better equipped to get through this?
China or the
Both.
US?
China, US, yeah, I mean,
I think China is,
how do
and
you
I'll
see them
say
going
why.
forward?
And I'm going to say straightforward. I think, as I said, the manufacturing sector still looks strong. The resources still look strong, and I think that they have a purposeful government. The United States lacks that. That's where the core weakness in the US lies, is at the center of power in Washington. It doesn't have a strong government there. And China's government is able to do the things that are needed to deal with its economic problems. Every country at some point experiences economic problems, but you can respond to them. If you're a government with the kind of resources that the US government has and the Chinese government have, you should be able to respond to them. In China they are. In the US they're not. In the US, on the contrary, what we saw was the Biden administration, they passed a new anti-inflation bill, which by increasing spending is going to increase inflation. That's my own view.
All right. Anything else to add? This is a short video.
Well, it is a short video. Now, I know people find it difficult to believe that China can go into recession. I suspect China has had other periods of recession in the past. I think China will get through this, though there will be some damage done. But, recessions are necessary to purge imbalances out of the system. The US used to know this very well. The creative destruction, what Schumpeter was talking about. The US used to understand that. I think that both countries need recessions. The trouble is, the way it's been done in the US is so chaotic, and the government's response is so bad that it's going to simply aggravate things and make things worse. So I think China will, after a time, will adjust and get through. I think in the US, frankly, it will need a different administration.
Yeah. How does this affect the situation in Taiwan for China?
Oh, I think
Does
it
it
makes
factor
the
to Taiwan or
Chinese.
no?
Yeah, I think it makes the Chinese even more determined to sort out the problem of Taiwan, because however much an economic recession is going to create a sense of political fragility. I want to stress fragility, not a political crisis, but I think that's going to make Chinese leaders even more determined that they're not going to let the situation in Taiwan fester. And I suspect that you're going to see more focus on building up Chinese military forces and doing what needs to be done to bring the situation in Taiwan under control, by which I mean bring Taiwan under China's control.
Right. All right. We will leave it there. TheDuran.locals.com, everybody, and go to the Duran shop. 10% off. Use the code GOODDAY. Take care.